All right, friends, good morning. Welcome. Welcome. One year I taught a Calvin seminar, and at the end of it, in the course evaluation, someone said, too much Calvin. I mean, we were studying Calvin, right? So, too much Calvin, right. But yes, he continually says, by nature, I love brevity. By nature, I'm not tenditious. By nature, I love peace. He was a mixer. He was a provocateur. He was a workaholic. He was a wonderfully charismatic person. There's a long string of his former friends. Hi. Thank you. Yes, oh yes. Good morning.
Well, this is our last week with Dr.
Hi.
Sawyer. It's so exciting. We're definitely going to have him back, at least during my time here. We love having him. And last week, remember that next week is World Communion, so we will not have an 8:30 Bible study, like adult forum. So if you come, you can have coffee with me, but you won't have a teacher up here teaching. And then on October 9th, we will invite Dr. Taylor Worthy, who is from Wheaton College. He has a 10% grant right now, which is a good deal, right? Like a really hard to get. He's an art history professor. He's also theologically trained, so he'll be telling us about how art can inform our faith, how we can use art to better understand our faith, and the work that it's doing. So,
Thank you. I'm so glad that you're inviting this person from Wheaton to come talk about art and art's transformative power. In part because, as we were talking last week about patterns of Reformation, that we Reformed Christians need to talk to the art historians more often because our little strand of the Reformation tends to be rather suspicious of image, or wary of image, or aware of the fact that many of us are unduly tempted to focus on the image rather than on the word or the content of a framed reality. So I'm glad he's coming. Thank you so much for these Sundays together, brief conversations. It's nice to be back in Deerfield, and thank you for your warm welcome. Thank you for the characteristic hospitality of this congregation, and thank you for the investments that you're making, especially in the lives of children. As a seminary professor, as a teacher in a seminary, I get to visit lots of congregations. And some are living into the practice of raising up a new generation better than others. And so thank you for your exemplary work. Thank you for the investment in the younger generation. And thank you for the care that you take even for children you don't know. Because the effects then are seen in ways that you may not see, but you can be certain they are very real. As the beneficiary of a robust religious education program in my own home congregation in Bellevue, Nebraska, I can testify to the effects of a caring curriculum. So again, thank you. Nice to be back. We're here the third of our 3 weeks together. I survived the Children's Book Fair in Hyde Park, and I survived in part by a shape-shifting jiu-jitsu move in which I yielded my role in the Peter Rabbit costume to a younger, more able person who plied him with lots of water, escorted him around the ocean of children looking for him, and his companion, Madeline, as well. And we had a good time in Hyde Park last Sunday. So it's nice to be back, and good to be about the business of thinking about matters congregations and trajectories and the temptations and the resources of life together in congregations. Again, it's nice to be back in face-to-face in a room together as well after so much time separated, right? This is a precious gift. I hope you're all boosted. I am. So that we continue to take care for one another, but also recognize that there are some things that we can only do if we come together, if we speak together, if we dare and risk being together to disagree with one another as well as to agree with one another. Right. Thank you for your patience as well as putting up in a small conclave of Texans as we were comparing notes too. So again, thank you for the gift of community and the risk of community as well. So thank you. Now, I have a handout. I hope everyone has gotten it. Let's see. More images, right? I went on your website and looked at a couple of things that y'all are doing. So you'll recognize the first two things. Next week is World Communion Sunday. That's great. And of course, the congregation's emphasis on feeding programs and the importance of being attentive to issues of hunger in the world. And then on the right is a colleague of mine. She's the president of North Park University, and a colleague of mine, William Jones. William Jones, who is a resident of Stateville Penitentiary and has been there for 38 years and spent 8 years on death row before the commutation of his sentence to a life sentence. So I met him at Stateville 5 years ago, and so we'll have a few things to talk about the two of them as well. So let's just recall where we've been. The first week we were talking about early church and the development of communities of faith that emerged from within Judaism. Judaism in its diversity, its integrity, and its depth and reality, and that Judaism, of course, has continued in its integrity and depth and reality long through the Common Era, the emergence of Christianity, first as a revival movement within Judaism, and then the Jesus movement finding its own pathway in a constructive, loving, and sometimes contentious relationship with Rabbinic Judaism, and that the history of the church includes a variety of good moves and false moves, temptations as well as affirmations. And we talked about the Pelagian temptation, the temptation to view ourselves as freestanding moral agents without any connection with anyone else, or the Donatist temptation, the temptation to think that our group is the only group that's gotten things right, or the temptation of Gnosticism to suggest that there's a secret knowledge, indeed a conspiracy, that only we have been delivered from, or the imperial temptation, or the establishment temptation. We talked about those our first week. And then we talked about, last week, we talked about patterns of Reformation in the 16th century, and noting that the world that we live in now is, in so many ways, especially for Christian communities, in large ways framed by, peopled by, categorized by many of the patterns that emerged in the 16th century. There are at least 6 forms of Reformation, pluralized Reformations of the 16th century. The Christian humanists, the Lutherans, the so-called radicals, Anabaptists, Mennonites, folks like that. The Reformed folk, this is the group that emerges from that strand, the Reformed and Presbyterian groups. The Anglican groups, and the Roman Catholic groups as well. So in so many ways, these patterns that emerged in the 16th century continue with us today. I mean, drive around Deerfield, we can see artifacts or exemplars of those 16th century reformations. Or my favorite example is that those of you who know Kalamazoo, Michigan, if you drive into the city of Kalamazoo and drive to the center of the town, then, oh, there's the Congregationalist church, and right next to it is the Presbyterian church, and right next to it is the Baptist church, and right next to it is the Episcopal church. And then there's the other breakaway Baptist church, and then there's the, right, so they're all gathered together, though, right, so that this remarkable American invention, the denomination, it's a great way of organizing the church, but it's not the only way of organizing church, that the denomination has extended and enlivened some of the divisions and distinctives of the renewal movements of the 16th century. Well, so how do we get through this outline today, though? I'd like for us to talk a little bit about post-Reformation worlds, the worlds of the Reformations, the worlds we live in here today. And that the separation of church and state could be read in some ways as a challenge to Constantine, right? That the organization of the church in the 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine joined with the Christians to decriminalize Christianity and to establish Christianity and to, in some ways, offer a model of church and state melded, joined, affiliated, in which the state would sanction different religious groups and privilege different religious groups, that Constantinian world is a world that we still live in. How come churches enjoy tax exemption? Constantine. Why is there no mail service on Sunday? Constantine. Why is it that even someone like Donald Trump had to appear at Liberty University holding a Bible? I mean, sometime in his life he should hold a Bible, right? Why? Because of Constantine and because of the expectations of Christian establishment, right? And so the separation of church and state, which characterizes this experiment as well as others, separation of mosque and state, separation of temple and state into secular constitutional governance structures, also brings some challenges too, right? That if the church and state are separated, then what's the relationship of voluntary organizations to the overtly secular state? This is really that the church and the state are separated, but all religious groups are encouraged to attempt to influence the state in whatever ways they can. So in some ways, this second phrase then, challenging disestablishment, varieties of religious mobilization and engagement. My old teacher, Mark Knoll, and sometime you should invite him out. He taught at Wheaton for many years. He taught at Trinity for a few years. He taught at Notre Dame for 20 years. And he's alive and well and writing just as clearly as he always has. He points out that virtually all social movements in America look like religious movements. They organize themselves kind of like religious movements. And a good example of this would be the Second Civil Rights Movement, for example, or earlier the anti-slavery struggle. The Second Civil Rights Movement, is it better viewed as a secular movement with religious allies, or is it better viewed as a religious movement with secular allies? I think it's the second. I think if you listen to the songs, if you listen to if you look at the organizational processes, if you look at the locations of meetings, mostly churches, that the Second Civil Rights Movement shows itself to be a religious movement that then was seeking to do its work of influence or suasion or exhortation or convincing in a variety of ways. And like most religious movements, it has its own history, it has its own arc, it has its own undulating patterns of development, extension, and then exhaustion. And so that social movements come in waves. Social progress comes in waves. Social regression comes in waves as well. So just offering this as a phrase. First, the first phrase of challenging Constantine, varieties of disestablishment and secularization in the modern world, but then at the same time, in the same places, for some of the same reasons, religious communities of conscience, organize themselves in order to challenge an overtly or ostensibly secular arrangement of power, and communities of faith and conscience then organize themselves either independently or in alliances in order to seek to accomplish their goals and to proclaim their truths and to offer support or comfort to people in need in their own particular polities. So I'd like for us to just think about the gifts that are part of First Presbyterian Church of Deerfield. Oh, before I forget though, when I was walking into the building, I was admiring some of the cars in the parking lot, and as a recovering librarian, I was particularly appreciative of one car that seemed to have its own library. There were multiple books in the back window, multiple books in the back seat, multiple books around and about, and of course, it was Maddie's car, right? So, right. So, as a recovering librarian, I thank you, because it was part commuting car and part bookmobile, right? So thank you for that. So I'd just like for us to meditate and just think for a bit, or allow ourselves to be reminded of the gifts, and increasingly valuable gifts, increasingly precious gifts, increasingly vulnerable gifts of congregations, including this one. The first point that I'd like to ask you about is just place. You're here in Deerfield. It took me a little while to drive up here. It's a fun drive, and for me, it's also just there's a cascade of memories as well, because I moved up here to Deerfield in 1978 to go to school, and so this building, this street, you people, these trees, it's part of my hallway of memory as well. So nice to be with you again. But your place here in Deerfield and the pattern of settlement in the city, in relation to the city, in opposition to the city. Deerfield, the very place is worthy of meditation and of some points of reflection. You know, cities look like they're stable places, but the city is coming to Deerfield, and some of the characteristics of suburban life now describe what the cities used to be like years ago. You know, for example, the immigrant experience used to be inner city, urban centered. That was the first place. But now, for the last 25 years, there are many folk who bypass the city and come directly to places like Deerfield, and as you know, right? So that if in the 50s Deerfield was known for its homogeneity, now Deerfield is better described and better known for the remarkable gift of varieties of communities that have sought to make their homes here, take their place in your schools, take your place in your communities, and to contribute their own particular experience to the collectivity that is Deerfield. That's a remarkable transformation. That's a remarkable change. Suburbs are not the suburbs that they were founded to be. Suburbs have become reflections and exemplars of a different kind of sociological mixing. And what used to be characteristic of the city is also changing. So the remarkable richness and benefits of the city has come to the suburbs, and also some of the challenges, some of the pathologies, some of the liabilities and costs of denser populations are now characteristic of places like Deerfield too. So, welcome to the city. Oh, and incidentally, again, I'd just like to invite you all, come back into the city sometime. Some of you were raised on the south side. Come on back and see about us, right? Come down and take a look at the Presidential Library in Hyde Park, or come down to the south side and take a look at McCormick Seminary and the Lutheran School of Theology, or the local college, the University of Chicago, and see about us. We'll tell you. I'll show you what's going on our little part of the south side of Chicago. Place very important. The promise of Deerfield, the premise of Deerfield, the trajectory of Deerfield is itself dynamic. It's not static. It's not an example of stasis. It's something that is itself part of the changing contingency of communities of faith, right? And this is illustrated by this point of difference that communities that have been characterized by homogeneity are increasingly characterized by heterogeneity. Even congregations too. Right, 50 years ago, when Didier was pastor here, Pastor Didier, the majority of members had been raised as Presbyterians. But now, I even learned that there are some Lutherans in the room, right? Right? So, so that congregation or denominational distinctiveness has yielded sociologically to a greater heterogeneity, both in points of origin, but also communities of origin, communities of formation as well, so that congregations themselves, including this one, display difference and heterogeneity in new and important ways. Histories. Successes from the past, failures from the past, right? We try to get away from the failures of the past, but we may also need to be liberated from past successes, and that models of the church may also need to recognize that there are many ways of organizing and gathering God's people, and that the house churches of the early church, the metropolitan polities of the early church, the establishment under Constantine, or the varieties of contextualized mission forms of the church may also find themselves here, even in Deerfield, and that the past successes of organization, both in the variety of ministries here, may need to be revised and may need to yield to new ways. I mean, I think it was the scriptures who said, my house shall be a house of prayer for all people. How is it that denominational particularism is beginning to chase after that biblical promise, that biblical aspiration, that almost utopian declaration of welcome, of hospitality, and of worship? Then prayer as the powerful disclosive element of power, right? One of the things that was so striking to me is listening to y'all pray, and then listening in my congregation on the south side, differences in language of prayer, and that the faithfulness of this congregation and the faithfulness of my own home congregation and the faithfulness of other congregations that I get to visit is exemplified in the language of prayer and the different styles, different resources, not just styles, but the different content of prayer. So I'm happy to say I get to stay, since I'm not running down to the book fair, I get to stay for worship today, but I'm particularly eager to join with y'all, having prayed with y'all and prayed for you, and been attentive to the ways in which your own expressions of faithfulness are so great a resource for mutual support, for engagement in the world, and for the proclamation of God's good news. And for that, I'm very grateful. Conscience. I'm convinced that congregations, among all the other things, they're also communities of conscience. But I think that the general engine of American Protestantism, at least, has been that churches are often centers of bad conscience. And this is my point, that I'd like to thank God for bad conscience. I'm glad for people who have good conscience and are sufficiently attentive to doing the things they need to do. But I'm also very grateful for the example of women and men over the history of the church whose conscience has been so troubled that they've been spurred to action. And that congregations then have a function, and I would suggest an important function, of cultivating bad conscience, of assuring the anxious, but also of troubling the complacent and the certain. And that the task of preaching, the task of teaching, the task of living together is at once to comfort the afflicted. Someone afflict the comfort, right? So thank God for the reality of a bad conscience. And if you meet someone with a bad conscience, welcome them. And then ask them, well, what is it that your bad conscience is prompting you to do? What is it that your bad conscience has motivated you to research? What is it that your bad conscience or troubled conscience or uneasy conscience has enabled you to see? Not only your insights, but also your blind spots. Not only your strengths, but also your weaknesses. That a congregation is an amalgam not only of assets, but of deficits as well. That happily, even First Presbyterian of Deerfield is not a collection of perfect people, but rather of people in search of God's grace, God's mercy, God's rehabilitative power, and God's restorative vision. Right, so could we all just thank God for a bad conscience, at least occasionally? Yeah. All right. Engagement. How is it that communities of faith then mobilize for engagement? Over the years, seeing the participation in short-term missions, seeing the commitment to long-term missions, seeing the connections with the presbytery, seeing, however troubled, seeing the presence, participation, and commitment and leadership in presbytery and denominational efforts, that there is power and purpose and biblical mandate then in the act of engagement. And so, you remember from various aspects of your earlier years when you would get to a committee meeting and the other members of the committee meeting, or the committee that you had joined, considered it to be the chief accomplishment for them just to get to the meeting, right? Rather than to think of the meeting as a purpose, its own purpose, right? And that things were supposed to happen at the meeting that would lead to some actions, right? Well, thank God for the connections of the Reformed tradition, that this congregation is in relation to other congregations that are Presbyterian, that are Congregationalists, and also in constructive relationship with other communities of faith as well, that this congregation does not define itself over against, but rather in some kind of constructive relationship with other communities of faith as well. And then the issues of the day. We noted that in the Reformation, the Reformed group, the Reformed and Presbyterians, this congregation exemplifies and stands in that tradition, that the Reformed tradition tends to view the issues of our current society as inevitably finding some way into this assembly, inevitably finding some way into the conversations, into the sermons, into the prayers, into the programs, into the agreements and disagreements that characterize committee work and conversations within this congregation. It's inevitable that the windows can't be high enough to keep out the world, that the thresholds of the door can't be fortified enough to keep the issues of the day out, that indeed, that as Reformed Christians and Reformed and Presbyterian folk, we acknowledge that however uneasily, however inexactly, however inexpertly we enter these conversations, we should do so with care, but that the issues of the day inevitably find their way into our common life here as well. So, this next section, Signs of Life, these are Greek words that have been used throughout the history of the church to describe characteristics. So if you're looking around First Presbyterian Church or any other lively congregation, I hope you'll see some of these signs. What are they? First, the transformation of lives, metanoia. Metanoia is sometimes talked about in terms of repentance or conversion, can also be talked about in terms of transformation and development, that wherever you are, when you come here, you are also on a pathway to become something better than you were when you came. Metanoia, to be transformed. Some transformations are more dramatic than others. I mean, I drove up here from Deerfield. I didn't drive on the Damascus Road. If you recall, when Paul was walking on the Damascus Road, that transformation was really quite dramatic. So, transformation, metanoia. Secondly, proclamation, kerygma, the message that is proclaimed from your pulpits, from your choir, from in your Sunday school classes. There is content, there is message, there is hope and formative truth that is being proclaimed. Y'all have not just gathered for social engagement, as good as that is and as important as that is, but rather to be open to and available to the proclaimed word, the taught word, the proclaimed word from your remarkable ministerial staff, from your remarkable teachers in every classroom, and from one another, that we as lay people have a right and privilege of engagement and encounter and proclamation as well. I'm not a pastor. I'm not ordained. I served as a deacon in my Presbyterian church years ago. But I study with and I train people who are training for ordination as a lay person, upholding the importance of lay theology, lay participation, our voice in congregations, on committees, in community ministries, in public discourse, that you are a member of this congregation when the city council needs you, when you're a member of this congregation when the local newspaper, if there is one left, asks you your opinion or your view on a particular topic, that you are a member of this congregation in your encounters at Deerfield Commons, whoever it is that you run into, that we are each in that way ambassadors of this congregation, members of this congregation writ large in the wider world. The next term, Doxologia, right? Praise. The psalmist says that your praise is forever in my mouth. Wow! People of praise, people whose life also tells a story, and our lives do tell stories, and sometimes we need to use words. That's what Francis said, right? Tell the truth, and sometimes use words, and that our lives, both individually and collectively, are also a song, are also a testimony, are also a testament concerning the things that we are most interested in, the things that we're most afraid of, the things that we understand ourselves to be most in need of as well. And so this community is also a community of praise and a community of need as well. Doxologica. Next, didache. Are there any autodidacts in the room? Well, you are. Right. Self-taught. Not didactic, that's an insult, but the autodidact is the person who is self-taught. Didache means the teachings. I mean, the fact that you're here this morning, that the life of First Presbyterian of Deerfield is not only solely in the sanctuary, but that the sanctuary is here too. The sanctuary is in your home as well, and that you are perpetually about the business of teaching and instructing and encouraging and occasionally discouraging and correcting and directing, but that there is a lot of teaching going on. Again, sometimes with words, right? Next, liturgia. Liturgia means the work of the people. And most of us, as lay people, have left the liturgy to the professionals. But in the early church, the term liturgia meant all of us getting together, all of us doing the work of liturgy, all of us having a role within the worshiping community. The Reformation reclaims that with this phrase of Luther's talking about the priesthood of all believers. Now, let's lay aside the masculinist language, just reclaim that as an aspect of the Reformations that we are still chasing after, that we're still running after, that we're still aspiring toward. If we leave the religious life to the professionals, then we're lost, because we need to be part of a more lively, living, dynamic, demanding, dialogic conversation that recognizes the gifts of God distributed among all of God's people, lay and those who are ordained, but often silenced from those of us who let the professionals do their work. Next, diaconia. Let's all say it. Diaconia. Gesundheit. Right. Okay. All right. Diaconia, service. Right. That this community of faith should also be characterized by its embodied, enacted commitments, and that the study is transformative. The proclaimed word is transformative, empowering, and requiring action. The diaconia. In a broken world, the needs of so many present themselves. And so there's a lot of work to go around. It's the same word that we get the word deacon from, diaconia. In some congregations, it's the deacons who do all of the service. But in fact, the deacons can't do it all themselves, can they? They need some help as well. koinonia, fellowship, community, collectivity, that there's some things that characterize this congregation that you won't find anywhere else. The distinctive gifts of this congregation, the loving presence and sacrificial lives in community that drew you here to this congregation are also being observed by others, by others who should come to join you here. So your own evangelism, your own invitations, your own quiet witness then is part of the dynamic life of this congregation. And martyria, martyr means witness. And, you know, some folks think of witness or testimony as emptying of the self, but I would try to flip that to refer to it as the ways by which communities are extended, enriched, and enlivened by the costly encounters with people you know and people you don't know, issues you are familiar with and issues you are unfamiliar with, issues you need to oppose and issues you need to work for and advocate, that all are part then of the process of a lively encounter within a lively congregation like this one. So I would refer to those as ways by which, if we're looking for a glossary of world transformation, that's it. If we're looking for signs of life in congregations, these are some of them, and I'm sure that you can add to these lists. If we're looking to ways by which you would say, well, right, it's good for us to come to this place on Sunday or during the week. It's good for us to refer to this place for those who need help. It's good for us to send our children to such a place as this. That these congregations, like this congregation, are about a very stunning project, a project to transform the world. And the church is an excellent means, modality, and location to do so, even and especially this congregation. So that's my point. I've said too much, and I'm wondering about comments, considerations, or denunciations, please. My quiet Quaker friends, I've said too much. On the back is a bibliography. I just wanted to lift up 3 or 4 contemporary writers. And one of them, this person of conscience who teaches at University of Virginia, I'd just like to bring him to your attention because he's a great writer and he has a troubled conscience. So that troubled conscience prompts him to write. He's written about the Second Civil Rights Movement. He's written about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he's written about the anxieties of growing up in contemporary church culture. His name is Charles Marsh. He's also written about what he calls embodied theology or enacted theology. And so I would just commend him to you. The second person I'd just commend to you is just folks that these are people worth reading, and so you could dip into this bibliography. And again, as a recovering librarian, I can't really leave my house without a bibliography, and so I just offer these things to you. Dominique Dubois-Gilliard, who teaches at North Seminary, his work Rethinking Incarceration and his work Subversive Witness, Scripture's Call to Leverage Privilege, very interesting and accessible book, worth reading. Or Martha Minow, known to Northsiders as the daughter of Newt Minow, right? Former dean of Harvard Law School. When should the law forgive? Looking at models of restorative justice to displace our current models of punishment in jails and in prisons. And then David Chappelle's classic work, A Stone of Hope, Prophetic Religion and the Death of Jim Crow. Seems to me to be a really good guide, kind of a thick read on the last 50 years of American life and seeing the ways in which communities of conscience and faith organized to attempt to drive a stake through Jim Crow, although it seems as if he's been resurrected lately, hasn't he? Right. So all that's been dead comes back to life in the American story, right? On the upper right-hand corner here is a picture of Mary Surge, the president of North Park Seminary, and an inmate from Stateville Penitentiary. For the last 5 years, I've been teaching at Stateville Penitentiary, and last year also I taught at Logan Women's Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. One of the ways in which that work has been powerfully important to me is to recognize the ways by which I had segregated the church by the walls of jails and prisons, and the ways in which connecting with the church inside jails and prisons has helped offer some new perspectives for me in my teaching, in my understanding of the work of the church, and in my understanding of recent American history as well. Gilliard's work on rethinking incarceration is a good guide. He also teaches at Stateville, and a good guide as well to a broader understanding of the church that crosses over some of the boundaries that are so very important to us. Boundaries of class, boundaries of race, boundaries of incarceration or freedom from incarceration, boundaries of citizenship. How broad is our understanding of the church? Or how susceptible have some of us, myself, been to a kind of donatism that has limited an understanding of the church to one group or one sensibility or one demographic, or at most several demographics. But maybe the church is bigger than that. Sir?
Could you speak to that last Marsh book? Just a glimpse about.
And it's a very prolific author. His most current, Wayward Christian Soldiers, the gospel from political captivity, also kind of lifts up some of the temptations that we've been talking about, especially in the first week. And he suggests that some aspects of American Christianity are particularly vulnerable to forms of subservience to nationalism. And so he's very critical of movements like, in Texas, I spent this summer in Texas, and there's a group of churches that call themselves patriot churches. Maybe you've heard about them. Started in the Northwest, and now there are a variety in the middle, in the boundary states, and the old Confederacy in the South, in which the American flag in the sanctuary is not something grudgingly accepted, but rather something enthusiastically endorsed. And that it is the national narrative which drives the interpretation of the biblical narrative. And so he's pushing back on that, suggesting that the biblical narrative is, he asserts, more important than any particular national narrative. So, I did bring some photocopies, and the photocopies I brought were from Augustine, from the 5th century, and a little section from Augustine's one of his most famous works, The City of God, which he wrote after the fall of Rome in the year 410, in which everyone was saying what the Patriot Church people will soon say: how on earth could God allow this nation to fall? And Augustine offers a heartfelt and thoughtful and insightful observation that God is bigger than any nation. God's narrative of loving redemption is more significant than even the heroic national or imperial narratives from which we derive a great amount of comfort and in which we stand for our own security as well. So, a brief note.
Well, let's just say there's an issue in this church about the church being involved in anything that's called political.
Uh-huh.
And it's a difficult conversation to have.
Right. Thank you for saying it. That in this congregation, y'all are again visiting the topic of politics and church. And in the Presbyterian folk would say, well, right, it is inevitable that politics will find their way into this congregation. The question is how you do it, how faithfully and lovingly you do it, and how it is that you disagree with one another, and how is it that this mixture of what I was saying between what the church is called to oppose. We oppose racism everywhere. We oppose violence everywhere. How that's one stance, but how is it that you link it then with agitation, advocacy, and endorsement? I mean, the church can stand against A, B, and C, but what does the church stand for? And how that you faithfully pursue that difficult and challenging agenda in ways that are informed by history and rooted in the scriptures and routed through the chastened recognition that this isn't the first time that this congregation has observed asymmetries of power or pain and brokenness in the world. And the questions are, how now in this time will this congregation faithfully respond in critique of error and harm, but also how will this church find ways of engagement, embodiment, and advocacy that are true to the gospel and are helpful and edifying to this congregation, and reflect on some of the strengths and resources that we've talked about that flow from the broader history of the church, the specific but diverse histories of the Reformation, and the provocative, activist life of Protestant and non-Protestant communities of faith in this national history. Yeah. So thanks for saying that. How you doing? How are y'all doing on these topics? I don't know. I mean, in the South, I mean, it's easy to kind of set up opposing camps, but folk disagree about strategies of observation, critique, and of engagement, and so you're walking together, you're working together, you're disagreeing together faithfully, and sometimes fitfully, and sometimes with stress and strain. You don't want to fall into the error of the 19th century church, who said the church has nothing to do with politics. And they proclaimed a doctrine called the spirituality of the church. That it sounds really rather Lutheran, frankly. Two kingdoms, right? The Reformed folk would point out that's an interesting way of endorsing the status quo, and is not a way of allowing space in the church for a troubled conscience or for an embodied in pursuit of a better approximation of justice. Right. So thanks for talking about that. Thank you all very much. I hear these children, they're all calling out, "He's done, he's done." Come help us. All right. Thank you, friends. Thank you.